Our next conversation is with Jefferson County Clerk and Recorder Amanda Gonzalez, who as of today is the first major Democrat to announce that she's going to make a run for Colorado Secretary of State in 2026, 18 months from now. Goodness, that's a long time. But thanks for coming in to have a chat.
Thanks for having me.
You have run elections, which is not a requirement for the job of Colorado Secretary of State. Current Secretary of State hasn't run elections. Does it matter?
I think it does. Yeah, I think that having the experience of running elections for about 500,000 people is really important, because when we think about election security, when we think about bringing people into the process, when I think about voter turnout, right, those are the key jobs of a Secretary of State, and I've got to do them on the ground.
So it's been pretty widely reported that there's not a whole lot of trust and confidence right now between the county clerks who actually administer elections and the current Secretary of State's office. What would you do to try and repair those relationships?
So I've been working in elections for a long time. Previously, I was the executive director of Colorado Common Cause, where I've written a number of the laws that govern our elections today. So I was the author on the bill that dramatically increased the number of counties that have to translate their ballots. Everybody should be able to read and understand their ballot. Our ballots are pretty complicated. I was somebody that was a co-author on the bill that doubled the number of drop boxes throughout the state. And so the clerks were pretty familiar with me. And sometimes when you're working in an advocacy organization, it's your job to advocate for the people, right? Not necessarily politicians. And so sometimes you're a little annoying. And I think that the clerks might have been a little bit nervous when I was coming in, but I'm really proud to say that I've built relationships, regardless of party. We have clerks that are Democrats, Republicans, unaffiliated. And sure, we've all seen Tina Peters. There are folks that are maybe bad actors. But by and large, the clerks, regardless of party, want fair elections, they want secure elections, and they want to run them well. And so if you're a friend of voting, you're a friend of mine.
How do you get rid of the tension, though, that exists right now between a number of the clerks and the state level?
Yeah, I think there's a lot we can do to work together. So I'm somebody that really in my core believes that you need more people around the table to make good decisions. An example of that is one of the first things I did when I took office is I created an advisory group that's focused on access, equity, and modernization, because I think I'm pretty smart, I think I'm pretty data-driven, but I only have one lens. And so let's bring more people in and let's make sure we get all the good ideas. And I see that with elections and the Secretary's office and the clerks, right? How do we work together more closely? A great example is the Secretary of State makes the rules for our elections, and the clerks have to follow those rules. The people on the ground are the folks that are the experts. So let's come together early, let's do workshops, let's have meetings that are open to the public where we're talking through what those rules are gonna look like, not just dumping them on people at the last minute. And I think that collaboration is the way that we build trust.
Is that currently happening now, in your opinion? That initial collaboration on the rulemaking process?
I think there's some of it, and I think there's a lot of room to grow.
Okay, what's something else that you'd like to change or improve about the way the office runs right now?
I think that people really deserve to know who's trying to influence their elections and their legislators. And the current system is called Tracer, that you go online to see what money is moving around in these areas. It's really hard to use. It's really confusing.
The back button doesn't function.
There's no back button.
Yeah, it doesn't function, but yes.
Yeah, and you and I are wonks. We're like in the weeds of all this stuff. And I want everyday Coloradans, if they want to know something about like, hey, who paid for this ad? Or who's trying to influence my legislator? I want that to be really like clear and easy.
And you don't see that as a partisan issue?
Absolutely not. I think that having transparency in government, I don't see that as partisan.
Let's talk about that issue of partisanship in the Secretary of State's office, because we've seen different models for this in the recent secretaries, right? Yeah. You had some recent secretaries of state who really tried to distance themselves from partisanship, like Democrat Bernie Busher and Republican Wayne Williams. Others have been very partisan while in office, like Jena Griswold, Democrat, Republican Scott Gessler. Which model would you follow?
It's sort of funny, right? I'm somebody who has worked on elections from a nonpartisan perspective for a really long time. In 2018 and 2020, I ran the state's largest nonpartisan election protection effort, so training hundreds of attorneys, I'm an attorney, on election law so that people who were experiencing any kind of question or who experienced voter suppression could call in and they had a nonpartisan resource. And I worked on a lot of policies that I'm really proud of. I mentioned that we expanded the number of counties that have to translate their ballots. For some of those things, I've been called radical. I don't think it's radical to think that every single person who's eligible to vote should vote and have their ballot accurately counted. And so what is partisan, what isn't, it's kind of the eye of the beholder. What I do think is true is that people deserve to know who they're voting for and who their elected officials are, right? You should know what my values are. That way you can decide if I'm the right candidate for you, and I hope that I am. And so, what is partisan, what isn't? I think you should know my values. I think you should know how I make decisions. As we've seen in the last couple of years, sometimes unprecedented things happen, right? And you have to trust, is this person I elected going to make sound decisions that are in the best interest of the people? And I absolutely will.
I tend to think that people do actually know what partisanship is, right? That they do know that the people who are rah-rah blue team, rah-rah red team, that's what partisanship means, right? And that while you may have run an organization that was nonpartisan because it had to be for tax status, it could have also been an ideologically oriented outfit, right? And I think people are curious to know because they've seen those two approaches. They've seen highly politically partisan secretaries of state, and then they've seen people that say, you know what, this job is about making sure that the votes are counted, so I'm going to take a step back away from party politics. And that's what I'm asking you. Are you going to take a step away, or are you going to follow the mold of a Scott Gessler or Jena Griswold and lean very heavily into party politics?
I'm going to absolutely follow my values. So I'll give you another example. When I came into office, I found out that in 2022, people who were incarcerated in our county jail, there's about 1,000 of them on any given day. In 2022, only 3 actually cast their ballot. To me, that's a civil rights issue.
Sure, that doesn't strike me as a partisan issue. What should voters take from your reticence to answer that pretty direct question?
But I think that some people definitely see that as partisan. I got a lot of messages on Twitter that said that they saw that as partisan, right? And I'm saying, no, I have eligible voters who aren't getting their ballots, right? And so what is partisan and what isn't? Sounds like you disagree with some of the folks who are messaging me on Twitter.
It's quite possible, but I'm asking you a pretty simple question, right? We know how Scott Gessler and how Jena Griswold have conducted themselves when it came to party politics. We know how others like Bernie Busher and Wayne Williams have conducted themselves. At the risk of asking the same question for a third time, which of those 2 models would you lean into? They're vastly different. You've got 2 guys who said, listen, I'm going to try to stay above the partisan fray, and then 2 others, man and woman, who said, you know what, no, this is red-blue, let's go.
I don't think it's red-blue, so maybe, I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay. What would you say to Coloradans who don't currently have faith in how elections are run?
I get the privilege of running our elections in Jefferson County, and it's been amazing, right? I think that sometimes if you watch Twitter or a number of other places online, you think that there is no way that Democrats and Republicans can get along. And I had the privilege of working with 800 election workers working in bipartisan teams. If I told you, hey, I'm going to send a Democrat and a Republican to be in a car all day together picking up ballots, you're like, oh, they're going to come back in a fight. And they're not. They come back talking about their grandkids.
Because they both have faith in the system, right?
Yeah.
The Republicans who work on elections in this state, I've met a ton of them, they have faith in the system. Yeah. What do you say to the people who don't have faith in the system, who are not part of it?
What I've told them while I've been in office is come see it. We offered more tours and did more community outreach than that office had ever done before. Because as long as you weren't making threats, right? As long as you weren't making threats, you're allowed to have questions about how the system works. You're allowed to say, hey, I saw a thing on Facebook and I have questions. That's great. Come on down, see the process for yourself, ask your questions and see how it works. Because we really do have fantastic systems in this state.
The Republicans who currently control Congress think that the way to restore faith in elections is to do national voter ID and to do national proof of citizenship for voting. What do you think?
That's, like most things with our Congress, it's a much more nuanced discussion than I think they want to give it credit for. The reality is that in Colorado, voter fraud on a major scale is virtually non-existent. Every once in a while, we see bad actors, but I think as we saw in this last election, we have systems that are designed to identify those people and catch them. And so the question that I think we should be asking is, how do we have safe, secure, and accessible elections? And we're not going to be able to answer that question in a soundbite. Right? That's just the reality. What we're going to be able to do is get a bunch of people around a table and say, what are your needs? What works for you? And let's talk about building systems that actually work for everybody. And when we're talking about the one-liners of, this is what we need and this is what's going to solve everything, yeah, we should have conversations. Security changes, technology changes, we should be looking at those things. We shouldn't be saying this is a one-size-fits-all approach, because often what happens in those situations is that we disenfranchise people, maybe inadvertently.
That might be the answer to my question, but I want to make sure that we get at it directly. So you're correct that even conservatives who've gone looking for voter fraud have found very, very few cases.
Right. Heritage Foundation.
It's Heritage Foundation in
less than
particular.
2.
Yep.
Yeah.
Even if this was a solution in search of a problem, what would be the harm in national voter ID and national requirement for proof of citizenship to vote? What would be the harm?
So folks like me who have a photo ID, I've got a birth certificate, that was pretty straightforward for me to get my Colorado ID, and that's great. There are people who maybe were born at home and don't have that same kind of birth certificate. Oftentimes it's people who are older. I don't want to disenfranchise eligible voters by creating a system that maybe wasn't necessary or wasn't the right solution. So I think there are a number of voters that don't have an easy time getting an ID the way that I do.
Would there be ways to strengthen voter identification, proof of eligibility, beyond a national standard that you would support, that you do think would be smart? Or do you think the system that we have as it works now in Colorado works functionally well and doesn't need improvement when it comes to those specific issues?
I do think that our system works functionally well. I don't know that I would say doesn't need improvement because our elections are run by humans. And like I said, technology changes, we learn new things every day. And so I constantly think that we should be improving our systems. One of the ways that I've done that as county clerk is we realize that new voters have fewer signatures on file. And of course, we match the signature on the outside of your ballot to the signature that we have on file. Maybe the first time you were registering to vote, you were really excited. And so you signed that Amanda M. Gonzalez, right? And then I was turning in my ballot and I was like, oh, let me sign it on the back of my steering wheel. And those two signatures looked a little bit different, right? We're going to send you a letter and say, hey, we need you to verify that you are who you say you are. And, we want to do that when we need to, but it's better if we have more signatures on file to compare to. And so I had hired an entire community engagement sort of department that we're creating. And we did more than 80 events in the community this last year. I'm super proud. We were at laundromats, we were at high schools, we were at libraries and dispensaries. And one of the things that we brought with us was a card that people could sign. They could take a picture of their ID and submit it to us so that we would have additional signatures on file, hopefully increasing the odds that we could match those accurately for first-time voters.
Did you find that it made any difference in the rate at which you had to have ballots cured than previously?
I don't have that data in front of me, and it was a relatively small program, but it's definitely something that we're exploring, and I think that those are the kinds of things that we should be looking at as solutions that might work for voters.
Secretary of State Griswold's office has made a series of high-profile errors that have negatively impacted voter confidence, sending tens of thousands of voter registration mailers to people who are not eligible to vote, posting voting system passwords online. What do you make of those errors and how you try to fix the error rate in that office?
Yeah. Like I said, human processes, and there just will be errors in human processes, which is why we have to build systems that have redundancies and that have multiple layers of security. So I mentioned before that one of the things that I did in a prior career was that I wrote some of the laws that govern our elections, and one of them was around strengthening security. So, in the instance where you have passwords that become public, right? You want to make sure that that password alone doesn't allow somebody to breach a system. And so the process did what it was supposed to, but that is why we have to have multiple layers of security.
What did you think of the office's communication around that? Not telling the clerks until it became public and not even committing that they were ever going to tell the public except that the leak leaked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was a hard day. I'm not going to lie. And I can't really comment as to what was happening inside the secretary's office because I wasn't there. What I can say is that in my office, I am so proud of how hardworking our staff was. And so, especially during a presidential election when temperatures can be high anyway, that was a hard day. I can tell you that it was something that, we are always doing continuation of operation planning. What if there is a breach? What if there is an emergency? And so it tested those plans, but all of the systems did what they were supposed to.
Yeah, certainly there's no evidence that elections were impacted, perhaps just people's confidence in them. Looking back at it, knowing just what you know, do you believe the Secretary of State's office made mistakes in how they handled the issue?
Yeah. Not being in that office, it's really hard to say, and I want to be fair. It is hard to say when I don't have all of the information that they had.
I'm guessing there's a lot of voters out there who have less information than you do that have a pretty good idea of whether they appreciated the handling or not. Are you willing to weigh in on what you thought of the handling?
I mean, what I can tell you is how I handle things in my office.
All right, we'll move on then.
Okay.
You spent taxpayer money on election billboards featuring your name and face. As Secretary of State, you would have a considerably larger budget with which to promote yourself if you were interested, as the Secretary of State currently has done with ads. If elected, would you spend state taxpayer money on ads, billboards, et cetera, that promote yourself?
We did a ton of outreach. So we had billboards, we had Facebook ads, we did all those community events that I mentioned. And so there was a billboard that was a portion of that strategy. We looked at data from national sources that said that election officials were the most trusted sources in accurate information, and that we want every single voter to vote. And in this case, we also want them to vote early. We knew from 2020 that unprecedented things can happen, and I want to make sure that every voter votes and has their ballot accurately counted. And so we put up a billboard that had my face, because all of the data said this is the trusted messenger, and here's accurate information about when you need to vote. Oh, and please vote early. And so I am.
The billboard didn't tell people to vote early, if I'm not mistaken.
It said that when
I believe it had a vote deadline.
Okay.
But yeah, your office's explanation was that people need the message to vote early, but the billboard with your name and face actually didn't say that.
Okay. I don't. Yeah.
I get asked by Coloradans whether it would be better for the Secretary of State's office to be an administrative position rather than an elected position. That's not for us to decide, right? We're just people, right? It's currently an elected position. But I hear from people who say, like, wouldn't it be easier if it wasn't a partisan position, right? If it wasn't a D or an R, if it was just an administrative position. Is there value in it being a statewide elected position, a partisan position? What do you think?
Yeah. I can give you an example from my role, because you might say the same thing about a clerk's office.
Sure.
Somebody would have to probably appoint that role, which would still put some politics in it. And I am really proud, I'm really glad that I'm not appointed. I'm responsible to the voters, and I'm responsible for sticking up for their needs and what is going to serve them best. A great example is back to that jail voting. My sheriff didn't want to have in-person voting in the jail. She testified against it in 2 committees. I knew that it was the right thing for voters. And so I worked really hard to make sure that we could have in-person voting in every jail in the state. And I told you that in 2022, 3 people voted. In 2024, we had about 350. We talked to one voter, it's a 29-year-old guy. He said that he'd never voted before, and he didn't know if he was eligible. He came down to talk to us because we were there. And he said that it was one of the top 5 experiences of his life, and that it made him feel like he mattered. That's such a privilege. Most people don't get to do that with their career, to make sure that every voter's voice is heard and that people know that they matter. I welled up in that moment, but if I had been appointed, right, if I had been responsible to other politicians, I wouldn't have been able to do that work. Right? But I'm not responsible to other politicians. I'm responsible to the people of Jefferson County, and I'm responsible to voters. And I get to do what's right for them. And I think being elected gives me the opportunity to do that.
I appreciate you coming in and sharing your perspective. 18 months is a long time to run a campaign. I'm sure we'll talk again, but thanks for coming in.
So good to see you.